I'm Catherine Mercer, 52, and I spent 30 years building a career in the United States Navy that took me from Ensign to Vice Admiral. For most of those years, my own father, a retired Navy SEAL Master Chief, called my work desk duty and introduced me to his friends as someone who works in an office. But when a young SEAL pushed me off a training dock at Coronado, not knowing I was the 3-star admiral there to inspect his unit, it set off a chain of events that changed everything. Have you ever given everything to a career, to a calling, only to have the people closest to you refuse to see it? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You are not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand tall after being knocked down, literally or otherwise, hit that like button and subscribe. My father was the strongest man I ever knew. Not in the way people say it at funerals, where they polish the truth until it shines. He was strong the way a breakwater is strong, immovable, unyielding, built to hold the line against everything the ocean could throw at him. He was a Navy SEAL for 28 years, and he wore that fact the way other men wear wedding rings. It was always there, it was always visible, and it defined every relationship he ever had, including the one with me. I was born in 1974 in Virginia Beach, Virginia. My father, Thomas Mercer, was 24 years old and a petty officer second class in the SEAL teams, assigned to Naval Amphibious Base, Little Creek. My mother, Linda, was 22, an elementary school teacher who had married the most intense man she'd ever met and spent the next 50 years trying to soften his edges. She never quite managed it. We lived in base housing until I was 6, then moved to a small ranch house 3 miles from the gate. Close enough that the sound of helicopters was background noise. Close enough that I could ride my bike to the fence line and watch the buds candidates running the beach in boots, their instructor screaming at them through a bullhorn while the surf crashed behind them. I was 8 the first time I stood at that fence and understood what my father did. Not the classified parts, not the deployments he couldn't talk about, just the simple, brutal math of it. These men ran until they couldn't run, swam until they couldn't swim, and then they kept going. And my father was one of them. I stood at that fence one afternoon in 1982, fingers hooked through the chain link, watching a line of candidates bear crawl across the sand. My father found me there after his shift. He was in his olive drab utilities, salt on his boots, and he looked down at me with something between amusement and exhaustion. "What are you doing out here, Katie?" "Watching," I said. "Can I do that someday?" He laughed, not mean, just certain. "Girls don't belong on the grinder, Katie. Come on, Mom's got dinner." He carried me home on his shoulders that evening. I remember the way his hands felt on my ankles, steady and sure, and the way the sun sat low over the base behind us. I remember feeling safe. I also remember the words, "Girls don't belong on the grinder." He said it the way you say the sky is blue, not as an opinion, as a fact. My brother Tyler was born in 1978. 4 years younger than me, loud where I was quiet, physical where I was analytical. Tyler was the son my father wanted. Not because Tyler was better, but because Tyler was a boy. And in my father's world, boys became SEALs, and girls became something else. Something quieter. Something less. I watched my father hand Tyler his SEAL trident when Tyler was 8. It was a Sunday morning, and the 3 of us were in the living room. Dad had the trident out of its case, the gold eagle and anchor gleaming on the coffee table, and he was explaining what it meant. The brotherhood, the sacrifice, the fact that fewer than 20% of candidates who start Bud S ever finish. Tyler held it in both hands like it was made of glass. I asked if I could hold it. My father hesitated, then handed it to Tyler instead. "Hold on to that, son. That's your legacy." My mother watched from the kitchen doorway. She didn't say anything. She rarely did when it came to my father and his certainties. I went to my room and opened my math textbook. I was 12 years old, and I had already decided I was going to the Naval Academy. Not because I wanted to prove my father wrong, because I wanted to prove that the fence line wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning. I told my parents I wanted to apply to Annapolis when I was 16. We were at the kitchen table. Dinner was meatloaf and green beans. My father set his coffee down and looked at me, the way he looked at a navigation chart that didn't make sense. "Annapolis is for people who want to lead ships and Marines, Kate. You'd be better off at Virginia Tech. Get a teaching degree like your mother." My mother nodded, not because she agreed, but because nodding was what she did when my father spoke. Tyler was in the backyard throwing a football at a tire swing. He didn't hear the conversation. He wouldn't have understood it if he had. I filled out the application that night. I didn't tell anyone until the acceptance letter arrived 18 months later. My father wasn't cruel about it. He was certain. And certainty, when it comes from someone you love, is harder to fight than cruelty. Cruelty you can push against. Certainty just sits there, heavy and immovable, and you have to figure out how to build your life around it. Induction day at the Naval Academy was July 1st, 1992. I was 18 years old. My mother drove me to Annapolis. My father refused to come. He said he had a training exercise. My mother and I both knew he didn't. She pulled up to the gate, and I got out with my duffel bag. She was crying before I closed the door. "He'll come around, Katie." I said, "I know, Mom." I didn't believe it. I called home that night from a payphone in Bancroft Hall. My father answered. The conversation lasted less than a minute. He said, "You'll be home by Christmas." I said, "I love you, Dad." He hung up without saying it back. He didn't call during plebe summer. He didn't call during the academic year. He didn't call when I made the dean's list. My mother sent letters every week, always signed Love, Mom, and Dad. And I knew the "and Dad" was a fiction she maintained because the truth was too heavy to put in an envelope. 4 years later, I graduated, May of 1996, Navy Marine Corps, Memorial Stadium, Annapolis, Maryland. I threw my cover in the air with 1,000 other newly commissioned officers, and somewhere in the back row, my father sat in a folding chair and clapped politely. He shook my hand afterward, didn't hug me. His SEAL buddies were there, and he introduced me to them on the way to the parking lot. "This is Katie. She's going surface warfare, driving the taxi." They laughed. I heard every word. I smiled. I found my mother, who was crying again. I hugged her and whispered, "I'm fine, Mom." And then I walked to the officers' quarters and started the career my father never wanted me to have. Surface warfare. That was his phrase for everything I did that wasn't SEAL work. Taxi driver, paper pusher, desk jockey. He had 100 ways to say the same thing. You're not one of us. I spent my first 2 years as a division officer aboard USS Shiloh, a Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser deployed to the Western Pacific. I stood watches in the Combat Information Center during a transit of the Taiwan Strait in 1999, tracking surface contacts on a scope while the ship cut through contested waters at 25 knots. My commanding officer wrote in my fitness report that I had flag officer potential. I was 25 years old. I called home after that deployment. My father answered. I told him the ship had just returned from the Western Pacific. He said, "You still on that cruiser?" I said yes. He said, "Your brother just made the varsity wrestling team." Then he hung up. I stopped waiting for my father to be impressed. I started building a career that didn't need his approval. In 2000, I transferred to Naval Intelligence. I'd been identified for a classified analytical program that pulled officers from the surface fleet into work I couldn't discuss with anyone outside a secured facility. The work was consuming, cerebral, and deeply consequential. I was 26 years old, a Navy lieutenant, and I was already operating in spaces most people didn't know existed. My father retired in 2002. 28 years as a Navy SEAL, Master Chief Petty Officer, the highest enlisted rank he could reach. He came home to Virginia Beach with a chest full of medals, a trident on his wall, and the unshakable belief that no one in his family would ever match what he had done. That Christmas, his house was full of retired SEALs. Beards, tattoos, stories about deployments they could only half tell. I arrived in civilian clothes because my assignment at the National Security Agency was classified and I couldn't discuss it. My father introduced me to his friends. My daughter, she does something with computers. Nobody's really sure. The room laughed. Tyler, 24 and freshly certified as a firefighter, laughed too. I smiled, poured myself a drink, and said nothing. I was already past him. I just couldn't tell him. That Christmas broke something in me. Not loudly, not the way bones break. More like the way a rope frays, one fiber at a time, until you look down and realize there's barely anything holding it together. I drove back to my apartment near Fort Meade that night and sat in the parking lot with the engine running. The heater was on, the radio was playing something I don't remember, and I made a decision. I was done performing for an audience that refused to watch. I would do the work, I would serve the country, and if my family ever wanted to know who I was, they could ask. I was done volunteering the information to people who treated it like an inconvenience. The years after that settled into a pattern. I would visit Virginia Beach 2 or 3 times a year. Christmas, Mother's Day, maybe Thomas's birthday if the schedule allowed. Each visit was the same. Tyler would talk about the firehouse. Thomas would talk about Tyler. Linda would cook too much food and hug me at the door and whisper that she was proud. And I would smile, eat my mother's pot roast, and leave before the silence between me and my father became loud enough for anyone else to hear. Tyler got married in 2005. His wife, Jenny, was a nurse at Centara, Virginia Beach General. She was kind and completely uninterested in the military. I went to the wedding, gave a toast, and left before the cake was cut because I had to fly back for a briefing I couldn't reschedule. Thomas mentioned my early departure to his friends at the reception. Katie had to go. She's always got some meeting. He said it the way you'd say someone always has an excuse. In 2003, I deployed to Bahrain as part of a combined Maritime Forces intelligence cell supporting Operation Iraqi Freedom. I was 29. I worked 18-hour days in a windowless building, analyzing signals intelligence and producing targeting packages for operations across the theater. I called home once a week. My father never asked what I did. Tyler texted me once during the entire deployment. 5 words. Stay safe, I guess. My mother sent care packages with cookies and handwritten notes. By 2006, I was a lieutenant commander on the Joint Staff at the Pentagon. I walked corridors where policy was written, briefed flag officers twice my age on intelligence matters I couldn't name outside the building, and watched the machinery of national defense operate from the inside. I drove to Virginia Beach one weekend and found my father at the VFW telling his buddies about Tyler's promotion to fire lieutenant. He saw me come in and waved me over. And this is Katie. She works in an office in D.C. The VFW regulars nodded and went back to their beers. He introduced Tyler as a hero every time. He introduced me as someone who worked in an office. After a while, I stopped correcting him. It was easier to be invisible than to fight for recognition from someone who had already decided I didn't deserve it. In 2010, I deployed to Afghanistan. I was 36, a commander, and the senior intelligence officer for a joint special operations task force in eastern Afghanistan. I spent 11 months in a compound surrounded by concrete blast walls, coordinating operations alongside Army Special Forces and Navy SEALs. My father's people, his world, the men he had built his entire identity around. I sat in their briefing rooms, reviewed their operational plans, and provided the intelligence that determined whether they went on a mission or stood down. I carried a sidearm and wore body armor and ate in the same chow hall as operators who had my father's trident tattooed on their arms. I could not tell anyone at home. There was a night in Bagram, late October, when mortars hit the compound at 0200. I was in the operations center when the first round landed 50 meters from the building. The lights flickered, dust came down from the ceiling. I grabbed my helmet and body armor and kept working because the mission brief for the next morning's operation was not going to write itself. The operator sitting next to me, a SEAL senior chief with 3 combat tours, looked over and said, "You good, Commander?" I said, "I'm good." He nodded and went back to his screen. That was the SEAL community at its best. No posturing, no judgment. Just, "You good?" And a nod. That senior chief didn't care that I was a woman. He cared that I was competent. And in that moment, in a dusty operations center with mortar rounds landing outside, I felt more at home than I had ever felt at my father's kitchen table. I thought about calling home that night. I thought about telling my father that I was in a compound in Afghanistan, coordinating operations with his people, wearing body armor and a helmet, doing the work he always said women couldn't do. But I didn't call. Because even if I'd told him everything, he would have found a way to make it smaller. He would have said, "That's different from being in the teams." Or, "Intelligence isn't the same as kicking down doors." And he would have been right. It wasn't the same. But it was no less important, no less dangerous, and no less worthy of respect. I just couldn't make him see that. And somewhere during that deployment, standing in the dark outside my hooch, looking up at the stars over the Hindu Kush, I stopped trying. When I came back, my father asked where I'd been. I said, overseas. He nodded and changed the subject to Tyler's new house. I sat at the kitchen table and ate my mother's pot roast and listened to my father talk about my brother for 45 minutes. When I left, my mother walked me to the car. She held my hands and said, I'm proud of you, Katie. I don't know what you did over there, but I'm proud. I said, thanks, Mom. I drove back to my apartment and sat in the dark for a long time. In 2012, I was promoted to commander. I called my mother to tell her. She cried and said she was proud. I asked if Dad wanted to talk. She paused. He's watching the game, honey. I said, that's okay, Mom. I hung up and pinned my new oak leaves on by myself, standing in front of the bathroom mirror in my apartment in Pearl Harbor. There was one moment in 2014 that I have never told anyone. I was a captain select, waiting for my command assignment, temporarily assigned to the Navy staff. My father came to D.C. for a Vietnam-era SEAL reunion at the Navy Memorial. He called and asked if I wanted to get dinner, just the two of us. I remember the surprise I felt, and then the hope, and then the effort I put into crushing the hope before it could take root. We ate at a steakhouse near the waterfront. For 30 minutes, it was the closest we had been to a real conversation in 20 years. He asked about my apartment, I asked about his knees. We talked about my mother's garden, and then he leaned back in his chair and said, you know, Katie, I always thought you'd come to your senses and do something real with your life. But I guess the Navy takes all kinds. He meant it as a compliment. I could see it in his eyes. He genuinely believed he was being generous. I paid the check and drove him back to his hotel. In the parking lot, he patted my shoulder and said, good seeing you, kid. I said, good seeing you, Dad. I drove home and did not cry because I had run out of tears for this particular wound sometime around 2006. In 2016, I was promoted to captain and took command of USS Howard, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer. I had a crew of 330 sailors and the most advanced weapons system afloat. My father sent a card. It said, congratulations on the new job. Not the new command, the new job. Like I'd been promoted at an insurance company. Taking command of a destroyer was the closest I ever came to understanding what my father felt about the SEAL teams. When you stand on the bridge wing of a warship at night, cutting through open ocean at 30 knots with 330 sailors depending on your judgment, you understand something about leadership that no classroom can teach. You understand that the weight of responsibility is not a metaphor. It is physical. You carry it in your shoulders, in your jaw, in the way you sleep with one ear open because the phone might ring and the wrong call at the wrong moment could put people in body bags. I commanded that ship for 2 years. We deployed to the Western Pacific and the Arabian Gulf. We conducted freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. We participated in exercises with the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force and the Royal Australian Navy. And I stood on the bridge at 0300 and watched the phosphorescence trail behind the ship like a ribbon of green fire on the black water and thought about my father standing on a dock in Coronado 40 years earlier, watching the same ocean from a different angle. And I wanted to call him and say, I understand now, Dad. I understand what you gave. But I didn't call. Because he would have said, that's nice, Katie. But it's not the same. And he would have been right that it wasn't the same. But he would have been wrong that it was less. My executive officer during the second year of command was a woman named Lieutenant Commander Sarah Voss. Smart, driven, tough. She reminded me of myself at that age. One evening, after a long day of drills, she asked me how I'd gotten this far. Not the career mechanics, the promotion boards, and the fitness reports. How I'd kept going when the institution, the culture, the men around me, and my own family told me I didn't belong. I told her what I'm telling you now. You don't need permission, you just need to refuse to stop. In 2020, I pinned on my first star. Rear Admiral Lower Half, assigned as Director of Intelligence for U.S. Indo-Pacific Command at Camp Smith, Hawaii. I didn't tell my father. My mother found out from a Navy spouses group newsletter and called me in tears. She asked if she could tell Thomas. I said, "You can tell him whatever you want, Mom. He won't hear it." 2 years later, I made Rear Admiral. 2 stars. Then in 2024, Vice Admiral. 3 stars. Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Operations, Plans, and Strategy. One of the most senior positions in the United States Navy. I worked out of the Pentagon, 3 floors above, where I'd walked the corridors as a lieutenant commander 18 years earlier. My father still introduced me as someone who worked in an office. And then came Coronado. In May of 2026, I was dispatched to Naval Special Warfare Center, Coronado, California, to conduct a surprise fleet readiness assessment of SEAL team elements ahead of a major Indo-Pacific deployment. The assessment was classified until arrival. No advance notice to the command. I would walk in, observe, evaluate, and write a report that would determine whether those teams deployed on schedule or stood down for remediation. I flew into San Diego on a Wednesday evening and checked into base lodging at Naval Air Station, North Island, under a generic reservation. My flag aide, Commander Elena Davis, was arriving the next morning with the rest of the inspection team. I had one evening to myself. I changed into running clothes, gray t-shirt, black leggings, running shoes, no insignia, no indication of rank. I looked like any 52-year-old woman who kept herself in shape. I walked out the door and headed toward the Special Warfare Compound. I wanted to see Coronado the way my father saw it, before the briefing slides and the prepared presentations and the officers standing at attention. I wanted to walk the grinder, stand on the dock, feel the salt air that my father had breathed for 28 years. I had spent 30 years in the Navy, and I had never set foot on the base where it all started for him. The training dock was on the ocean side of the compound, near the BUDS first phase area. Concrete, scarred by decades of boots and equipment. The Pacific stretched out beyond it, gray-blue and restless, the surf zone visible where candidates did their conditioning swims. The sun was coming up, painting the water in gold and copper. I stood at the edge of the dock and looked out at the ocean. I thought about my father. 28 years he gave to this place, to the water, to the sand, to the men who trained beside him. He gave everything to the teams, and he never had anything left for me. I heard footsteps behind me. 2 sets, heavy, confident, the kind of footsteps that belong to men who own every room they walk into. Petty Officer First Class Jake Briggs was 28 years old, fresh off his second deployment, and every inch the kind of SEAL my father would have been proud of. Broad shoulders, crew cut, a walk that said he had never been uncertain about anything in his life. His swim buddy, Petty Officer Second Class Dex Holt, was right behind him. 26, leaner, with the easy grin of someone who thought the world was built for his amusement. Briggs saw me standing on the dock and his face tightened. A middle-aged woman in athletic clothes, standing on a restricted training dock at 05:30 in the morning. He didn't hesitate. "Hey, restricted area, sweetheart. Move." I turned. I reached for the lanyard around my neck where my credentials were tucked inside my shirt. I said, "Move." He didn't wait. He put both hands on my shoulders and pushed. Hard. I went backward off the edge of the dock and hit the water. The Pacific off Coronado in May is not warm. The cold hit my chest like a fist. I went under for a moment, then surfaced, gasping, salt water stinging my eyes. I looked up. Briggs was standing at the edge of the dock, looking down at me with the same expression my father used when he carried me away from the fence line at Little Creek. Mild annoyance, casual dismissal. You don't belong here. "Next time, read the signs," he said. Dex Holt doubled over laughing. The sound carried across the water. I treaded water and looked at Briggs. He was already turning away. I had been dismissed by a lot of people in 30 years. My father, my brother, officers who did not believe a woman belonged in their briefing room. But nobody had ever put their hands on me. Nobody had ever pushed me off a dock like I was nothing. I was not nothing. Commander Elena Davis had arrived on an earlier flight than scheduled. She had been walking the compound looking for me when she heard the splash and the laughter. She reached the dock at a dead sprint. She was in uniform. Her voice cut through the morning air like a knife. "That is Vice Admiral Mercer! That is Vice Admiral Catherine Mercer!" The laughter stopped. Briggs froze. Holt straightened up so fast he nearly fell over. Davis was already on her radio, calling the compound duty officer. She dropped to one knee at the edge of the dock and reached for my hand. I took it and pulled myself up. Water streamed off my clothes and pooled on the concrete. Captain Marcus Ward, the commanding officer of the SEAL element, arrived within 60 seconds. Master Chief Dan Rooney, the command master chief, was right behind him. Ward saw me standing on the dock, soaking wet, running clothes plastered to my body. He saw Briggs at the edge of the dock, standing at rigid attention, white-faced. Ward's voice was controlled, but barely. "Petty Officer Briggs, do you understand what you just did?" Briggs could not speak. Rooney stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's the 3-star who's here to inspect us tomorrow, son." I stood on the dock, dripping, the Pacific wind cutting through my wet clothes. I looked at Briggs. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. "Captain Ward, I'll see you and your team in the briefing room at 0800 tomorrow, as scheduled." I turned and walked off the dock without looking back. Davis fell into step beside me. Neither of us spoke. The sun was fully up now, the compound waking around us, and Coronado looked exactly the way my father had described it to me when I was 8 years old. The grinder, the surf, the sand that broke men who thought they were unbreakable. I had not broken. I was wet, I was cold, and my shoulders ached where his hands had been, but I had not broken. I went back to base lodging, showered, changed into dry clothes, and sat on the edge of the bed. Davis brought coffee. She asked if I wanted to press formal assault charges against Briggs. I told her I would decide after the inspection. She nodded and left. I sat alone in that room and held the coffee in both hands and thought about the word he'd used. "Sweetheart," my father used to say it the same way, not as affection, as dismissal. "Sweetheart, you wouldn't understand." "Sweetheart, that's not for you." "Sweetheart, sit down." 30 years apart, 2 different men, the same word, the same tone, the same assumption. I did not belong. I called my mother. She answered on the second ring. I told her I was in Coronado for work. She said, "Coronado? Oh, Katie, that's your father's base." I said yes. I did not mention the dock. She would have told my father, and my father would have made it about himself. He would have said something like, "SEALs don't push women off docks. She must have provoked him." And I would have spent the rest of the week explaining myself to a man who stopped listening 30 years ago. I told my mother I just wanted to hear her voice. She said she loved me. I said I loved her too. I hung up and finished my coffee. Davis came back with a preliminary incident report. Briggs had been confined to quarters pending investigation. The compound CO had initiated a formal review. Davis set the report on the desk and sat across from me. "Admiral, for what it's worth, Captain Ward looked like he was going to pass out when he saw you standing on that dock." I almost smiled. "I've had worse mornings, Elena." She didn't say anything else. She'd been my aide for 2 years and had never seen me rattled. I wasn't rattled now. I was something else entirely. Something quieter and colder. Something that had been building for 30 years. I walked through the compound alone that afternoon. Past the Buds' first-phase barracks where the walls were salt-stained and the air smelled like sweat and sunscreen. Past the grinder, the asphalt square where candidates did their calisthenics in the sand. Past the bell. The bell? Every Bud-S candidate knows the bell. It hangs at the edge of the grinder, and when a candidate quits, he walks up and rings it 3 times and sets his helmet on the ground. It's the sound of giving up. The sound of deciding that the pain is more than the dream is worth. I stopped at the bell and put my hand on it. The metal was cool and smooth, polished by decades of hands, some of them reaching for it in exhaustion, some of them touching it the way I was touching it now, just to feel what it felt like to be close to the edge and choose not to go over. I did not ring it. I stood there for a long time, my hand on the bell, the Pacific wind on my face, and I thought about every time I'd been pushed off a dock. Not literally, but every time someone had put their hands on my career, my dignity, my worth, and shoved me into cold water. My father, my brother, commanders who didn't believe, colleagues who assumed, and now a 28-year-old SEAL who looked at me and saw nothing worth respecting. I let go of the bell. I turned and walked toward the briefing building. Tomorrow was the inspection. I had work to do. The next morning, I sat at the head of the briefing table in service khakis, 3 silver stars on my collar, and watched Captain Ward present his readiness brief. His voice was professional but tight. Every operator in that room knew what happened on the dock. I could feel it in the way they held themselves, the way their eyes tracked me without quite meeting mine. I didn't mention the dock. I didn't need to. Every man in that room was sitting straighter than he had ever sat in his life. Ward tried to address it early. "Ma'am, on behalf of my command, I want to express—" I cut him off. "Captain Ward, brief me on your deployment readiness. That's why I'm here." He nodded once and continued the brief. I asked precise, informed questions. I knew the SEAL community inside and out. I had spent 11 months coordinating their operations in Afghanistan. I knew their force structure, their training pipelines, their equipment readiness metrics, and their deployment cycle timelines. The operators in that room realized quickly that the woman their shipmate had pushed into the water was not a tourist. She was the most informed flag officer most of them had ever briefed. After the inspection, Davis and I returned to my temporary office. She asked what I wanted to do about Briggs. I had made my decision. Include the incident in the assessment, recommend non-judicial punishment and removal from the deployment roster. Let Captain Ward handle his own man. I didn't want to destroy him. He was 28. He was arrogant and stupid, but he was 28. I remembered being 28. I was a lieutenant in intelligence, and I thought I knew everything too. The difference was that I never put my hands on someone. The institution would handle its own. That was how the Navy worked. That was how it had always worked. That evening, I called Tyler. He picked up, surprised. I almost never called him directly. I told him I was in Coronado. He said, "Dad's base? What are you doing there?" "Inspecting a SEAL unit." Tyler laughed. "They let you do that?" I didn't laugh. The silence stretched until it filled the room. "Wait, are you serious? You're inspecting SEALs?" "Tyler, I'm a Vice Admiral. I inspect whatever the Navy tells me to inspect." He went quiet. I could hear the television in the background. He didn't say anything for a long time. My brother didn't know my rank. He didn't know my title. He didn't know anything about me except what my father had told him, and my father had told him nothing worth knowing. Tyler drove to our father's house that evening. Thomas was in his recliner, watching a documentary about SEAL training. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so predictable. Tyler told him Kate called, that she was in Coronado inspecting a SEAL unit. Thomas scoffed without looking up from the television. "Inspecting? She's probably attending a briefing and calling it an inspection." Tyler started to agree, then stopped. Something about my voice on the phone was different. He didn't push back on our father. Not yet. But the seed was there, planted in the silence between my rank and my father's certainty that I didn't have one. The dock incident entered the Navy's internal reporting chain and began to ripple outward. Briggs faced non-judicial punishment, reduction in rank to petty officer second class, forfeiture of half a month's pay for 2 months, and removal from the deployment roster. His career in the SEAL teams was effectively over, not by my hand, but by the weight of what he did. Captain Ward delivered the news personally. Briggs accepted it at attention. I never spoke to Petty Officer Briggs again. I didn't need to. The Navy has its own way of correcting course. And sometimes the correction is simply making someone stand in the truth of what they did. Back at the Pentagon 2 weeks later, Davis mentioned that Navy Times had picked up the story. No names, but the outline was clear. A flag officer had been physically assaulted during an inspection at a special warfare compound. I told Davis to let it run. The Navy would handle it. I wasn't interested in being a headline. I was interested in being what I had always been, someone who did the work and let the work speak for itself. But the Navy is a small community, and stories travel fast. My father was at his usual stool at the VFW in Virginia Beach when his buddy, retired Senior Chief Mike Callahan, mentioned the Navy Times piece. Some SEAL pushed a 3-star off a dock at Coronado. Can you believe that? A Vice Admiral. A woman. Thomas shook his head. What's the Navy coming to? He didn't connect the story to me, because he had never imagined I could be the woman in that story. A week after the Navy Times piece, I received a handwritten letter at the Pentagon. It was from a female Navy lieutenant stationed in Yokosuka, Japan. She wrote that she had read about the incident and that knowing a Vice Admiral had faced the same kind of dismissal she dealt with every day and hadn't broken made her feel less alone. She said she kept a picture of the first female 4-star admiral on her desk and that she would add my name to the list of women who made it possible for her to believe the Navy had room for her. I read that letter twice. I folded it and put it in my desk drawer. I kept it. Not because it was about me, because it was about every woman who ever walked into a room where someone decided she didn't belong before she opened her mouth. I went back to my hotel room that evening and did something I hadn't done in years. I opened my laptop and pulled up the folder of photographs my mother had scanned and emailed me over the years. There was one from 1982, me at the fence line, fingers through the chain link, watching the beach. My hair was in pigtails. I was wearing a red t-shirt that was too big for me. Behind the fence, you could see the blur of candidates running in the sand. I stared at that photograph for a long time. The girl in the picture didn't know that the man she worshipped would spend the next 40 years looking through her. She just knew she wanted to be on the other side of the fence. I closed the laptop and turned off the light. The hotel window faced the ocean. I could hear the surf, the same surf my father had trained in, the same surf that Seal on the dock probably trained in every morning. The Pacific doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care about your rank or your gender or your father's opinion. It just tries to pull you under, and you either swim or you don't. I had been swimming my whole life, and I was tired. Not of the swimming, of doing it alone. Tyler couldn't stop thinking about my phone call. Back in Virginia Beach, sitting at his kitchen table one evening, he opened his laptop and typed my name into the search bar. For the first time in his life, he read my biography on the Navy's official leadership page. Vice Admiral Catherine A. Mercer, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Operations, Plans, and Strategy. 30 years of commissioned service. 2 combat deployments, surface warfare, intelligence, joint special operations, 4 commands. Decorations that took up half the screen. He stared at the official photograph. Me in service dress blue. 3 silver stars on my shoulder boards. The same jaw, the same eyes, the same sister he had spent 48 years not knowing. He closed the laptop and sat in silence. His phone was on the table. My number was on the screen. He didn't press call. Not yet. But something had shifted. Something that had been settled and certain for 4 decades was now loose, and he couldn't push it back into place. He called me 3 weeks after the dock incident. A Wednesday evening. I was in my Pentagon office reviewing deployment schedules. The conversation was stilted, the way conversations are when 2 people are trying to cross a bridge neither of them built. He asked about my job. I gave him the unclassified version. I oversee Navy operations planning. Tyler said, "That sounds important." I said, "It is." There was a long pause. "I didn't know you were a 3-star, Kate." "You never asked, Tyler." He didn't apologize. Not yet. But he said my rank out loud, and that was more than my father had done in 30 years. My mother called the following weekend. She told me Tyler had been coming over more often, asking questions about my career. She said she had shown him the box, a shoebox in her closet where she had kept every letter, every promotion announcement, every fitness report excerpt I had ever sent her. 30 years of my career in a shoebox in her closet. She never showed it to my father. She never put it on the mantle next to his trident. She kept it hidden, like a secret, because in our family, my career was a secret. Tyler sat at her kitchen table for 2 hours and read every piece of paper in that box. He didn't say much. He just read. A few weeks later, Tyler drove up to Arlington on a Saturday. I met him at a coffee shop near my apartment. It was the first time we had been alone together in years. He told me he had read my Navy bio. He told me he had no idea. He told me he was sorry, not for anything specific, just for not knowing. I accepted the apology, but I told him plainly, "You didn't not know, Tyler. You chose not to look." He flinched. I wasn't going to let him off easy. He was my brother. He had had 48 years to ask me a single question about my life, and he had spent those years repeating whatever Dad told him. Sorry was a start, but a start is not a finish. He didn't argue. He just looked at his coffee. I could see the gears turning behind his eyes. He was recalculating 30 years of family math, and the numbers were not coming out the way he expected. I told him something I had never told anyone in my family. I told him about the night in Afghanistan in 2010, when a signals intercept I had analyzed pointed to a planned ambush on a convoy route that a SEAL platoon was scheduled to use the following morning. I stayed at my desk for 22 straight hours, cross-referencing the intercept with satellite imagery and human intelligence reports, until I was certain the threat was real. I walked the intelligence to the task force commander at 0300. He rerouted the platoon. The ambush was sprung on an empty road 6 hours later, an IED and 2 machine gun positions. It would have killed everyone in the lead vehicle. The platoon leader sent me a note afterward. 2 words. Thank you. I kept that note in my wallet for 15 years. Tyler looked at me like he was seeing a stranger, and in a way, he was. The sister his father had described to him for 48 years bore no resemblance to the woman sitting across the table holding a paper coffee cup. We walked the National Mall after coffee. Tyler asked about Afghanistan. I told him what I could. Not the classified parts, but the parts that matter. The fear that lives in your stomach when you know the intelligence you produced will determine whether people come home. The exhaustion of 18-hour days in a windowless room. The weight of knowing that a wrong call means body bags. Tyler listened without interrupting. At the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, he stopped and looked at the names etched in the black granite. Dad never told me any of this. Dad never knew. We stood at the wall for a long time. I pointed to a name near the bottom of panel 47 West. Lieutenant Michael Torres. I had written a report on his unit's final engagement as part of a historical intelligence study early in my career. He was 23 when he died. Tyler didn't ask how I knew the name. He just looked at it and nodded. I think in that moment he understood something that my father never had, that there are many ways to serve, that some of them are loud and some of them are quiet, and the quiet ones are no less important for being invisible. I think Tyler was seeing his sister for the first time. Not the version Dad built, the real one. He put his hand on my shoulder, the same shoulder a SEAL had put his hands on 3 weeks earlier. This time it was the gentlest touch I had felt in years. Summer passed. I buried myself in Pentagon work. The Indo-Pacific deployment exercise consumed most of June and July. The Coronado inspection report had been filed. Briggs had been reassigned to a shore billet. Life moved on the way it always does in the Navy, one watch rotation at a time. Tyler started working on our father, not confronting him, planting questions, small ones. Did you know Kate was in Afghanistan in 2010? Thomas waved it off. Everyone goes to Afghanistan. Doesn't make you a SEAL. Tyler tried again. She inspected a SEAL unit at Coronado, Dad. Thomas looked up from the television. Inspected? Kate? Tyler nodded. Thomas turned back to the screen. She probably sat in a briefing room and signed some papers. Tyler was trying. I'll give him that. But my father had 30 years of practice dismissing me, and Tyler had 3 weeks of practice pushing back. It was not a fair fight. Davis mentioned in July that I'd been selected for a leadership award from the Navy League, a public ceremony in October in Washington, D.C. I nodded and moved on to the next item on my schedule. I'd never cared about awards. The Navy gave me everything my family didn't. Recognition, respect, a place where the work was the only thing that mattered. I stopped needing my father's approval somewhere around my 2nd star, but I never stopped wanting it. And there's a difference. The retired SEAL network is smaller than people think. Everyone knows everyone. Stories move through it like current through water. In August, Mike Callahan, my father's closest friend, attended a reunion event for retired SEALs at the Little Creek compound. He ran into a retired captain who had been at Coronado during my inspection. The captain mentioned the Vice Admiral by name, Catherine Mercer. Callahan froze. He knew that name. He had known it for 52 years. He called my father immediately. Tommy, that Vice Admiral who got pushed off the dock at Coronado. Her name is Mercer. Catherine Mercer. Is that your Kate? My father didn't answer for a long time. Mike Callahan was my father's closest friend for 40 years. He was the one who finally said my name and my rank in the same sentence to my father's face. Not me, not Tyler, not my mother. A retired senior chief at a SEAL reunion. Thomas hung up with Callahan and sat in his recliner. The television was off. He reached for his laptop, the one Tyler had shown him how to use, and typed his daughter's name into the search bar. He found my official Navy biography. He read it. Vice Admiral, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations, 30 years, 2 combat deployments, Afghanistan. The photograph showed me in service dress blue, 3 stars on my shoulder boards, the same jaw, the same eyes he'd been looking at for 52 years. His hands were shaking. My father found out who I was from a Google search. 76 years old, sitting in the same recliner where he'd spent 3 decades calling me a paper pusher, and the truth was right there on the screen. He called my mother. His voice was different. He asked, "Did you know?" My mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've always known, Tommy." He hung up. He sat in the dark. His sealed trident was on the shelf above the television. For the first time, he wondered if it was ever as impressive as he thought it was. Tyler told me later what happened next. Thomas called him the following morning. His voice was rough, like he hadn't slept. He asked Tyler to come over. When Tyler arrived, Thomas was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. The laptop was open. My Navy biography was still on the screen. "She has 3 stars, Tyler." "I know, Dad." 3 stars. I made Master Chief. That's E9. She's O9. She outranks every SEAL who ever served." Tyler didn't say anything. He just sat across from his father and watched the man who had built his entire identity on the teams come to terms with the fact that his daughter had surpassed all of them. Thomas asked Tyler for my phone number. Tyler gave it to him. Thomas didn't call. Not that day. Not that week. He carried my number in his pocket for 2 months, and every time he reached for his phone, he couldn't make his fingers do it. Because calling me meant admitting that he had been wrong. And admitting that he had been wrong meant admitting that he had wasted 30 years of a relationship that he could never get back. Some truths are too heavy to carry and too painful to set down. My father held on to his for most of the summer. September passed. The leaves in Virginia Beach started to turn. My mother called me one evening and said in a careful voice that my father had been different lately, quieter. He hadn't been to the VFW in weeks. He was reading a lot. She found a book about women in the military on his nightstand. She didn't say anything to him about it. She just let it sit there. Some conversations happen in silence between people who have been married for 50 years and have learned that the most important words are the ones you don't say. October came. The Navy League ceremony was held in a grand ballroom at a hotel in Washington, D.C. I was seated at the head table with the Chief of Naval Operations, several other flag officers, and civilian defense leaders. I was in my service dress blue uniform. 3 stars on my shoulder boards. The MC read my citation. 30 years of commissioned service, 2 combat deployments, surface warfare, intelligence, joint special operations, 4 commands, and a career that reshaped how the Navy approaches operational planning. The room applauded. I had stood in a lot of rooms in 30 years, but this one felt different. Not because of the award, because of who I had become getting there. Every dismissal, every sweetheart, every paper pusher. I had turned them into fuel, and fuel eventually becomes fire. The ballroom was full, 400 people. Navy brass, civilian defense officials, congressional staffers, veterans. I sat at the head table and made small talk with the Chief of Naval Operations, who leaned over and said quietly, "Kate, you've earned this 10 times over." I thanked him. I didn't tell him about the doc, although he already knew. Everyone at that table knew. The story had traveled through every wardroom and flag mess in the Navy. The Vice Admiral who got pushed off a dock at Coronado and didn't raise her voice. Didn't press charges, just showed up the next morning and did the inspection. The SEALs talked about it. The surface warriors talked about it. The submariners talked about it. And somewhere in that story, I became something I never intended to be. A symbol, not of victimhood, of composure, of the kind of strength my father never taught me because he didn't know it existed. What I didn't know was that Tyler had driven my father to Washington that morning. Thomas didn't want to come. Tyler didn't give him a choice. They sat in the back row. Thomas wore a navy blazer and his SEAL trident pin on the lapel. He watched me walk to the podium. He saw the 3 stars. He saw the room full of admirals who stood when I stood. His eyes were wet. I didn't know he was there, Tyler told me later. He said Dad watched the whole thing without saying a word. He said Dad's hands were in his lap and they were shaking. I spoke briefly. I thanked the Navy. I thanked my mother. I thanked the sailors I had served with across 30 years and 6 oceans. I did not mention my father. I said, "The Navy taught me that the work speaks for itself. You don't need anyone's permission to be excellent. You just have to show up every day and refuse to stop." The room gave me a standing ovation. I meant every word. And I meant them for every woman who ever walked into a room where someone had already decided she didn't belong. After the reception, I exited through a side hallway. Tyler was waiting. He was alone. "Dad's here." I stopped walking. "What?" "He's outside. He drove up with me this morning. He watched the whole ceremony." I stared at Tyler. He looked at the floor. "He doesn't know what to say, Kate, but he came." I stood in that hallway for a long moment. I smoothed my uniform jacket. I touched the 3 stars on my collar. Then I walked toward the exit. Thomas was standing near the curb, hands in his pockets, looking older than I had ever seen him. The trident pin caught the streetlight. I approached. We stood 3 feet apart. He looked at my shoulder boards, 3 silver stars, and his jaw tightened. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Katie, I didn't know." I studied his face. I had spent 52 years reading rooms, reading people, reading situations. My father's face was the hardest one I had ever read. "Yes, you did, Dad. You just didn't want to see it." He nodded slowly. He took a breath. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. He held it in his open palm. It was his seal trident, the one from the shelf, the one he had shown Tyler instead of me when we were children, the one he polished every Sunday morning. He held it out. "I should have given this to you a long time ago. Not because you're a seal, because you earned it more than I ever did." I looked at the trident. It was smaller than I remembered. When I was 12 and Tyler held it at the coffee table, it seemed enormous. The golden eagle, the anchor, the flintlock pistol, the Neptune's trident. 4 symbols of a community my father loved more than he loved anything. More than my mother, more than Tyler, certainly more than me. And here he was, 76 years old, holding it out to his daughter on a sidewalk in Washington, offering it like an apology he didn't have the words for. I did not take it. I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around my father. It was the first time I had hugged him in years. He stood rigid for a moment, the way men do when they have forgotten how to receive tenderness. And then his arms came up, and he held me the way he should have held me when I was 8 years old, standing at that fence, watching the men on the grinder and believing she could be one of them. He held me, and he didn't let go. And neither did I. We stood there on the sidewalk in Washington, D.C., outside a ballroom full of admirals, while traffic passed and the evening turned cool. A 76-year-old retired SEAL and his 52-year-old Vice Admiral daughter holding on to each other for the first time in 30 years. Tyler was standing 10 feet away, watching. He told me later he cried. I believe him. Tyler was always the emotional one. He just didn't know how to point it at the right people until now. My father eventually let go. He stepped back. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, the way men do when they are pretending they are not crying. He looked at the trident in his palm. I closed his fingers around it. "Keep it, Dad. That's yours. I've got my own." I touched the 3 stars on my collar. He almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a genuine smile I had seen on his face in decades. Not the polite smile he gave at my graduation. Not the dismissive smile he wore at Christmas dinner. A real one, small and fragile and new. Tyler drove Thomas home that night. I leaned in the window of the truck and put my hand on my father's arm. "I'll come down for Thanksgiving, Dad." He nodded. He didn't trust his voice. Tyler started the engine. I watched the truck pull away. I stood on the curb in my dress blues, 3 stars catching the streetlight, and breathed the October air. The city was quiet the way cities are quiet after dark, when the machinery pauses and the streets belong to the people walking them. I could smell rain coming. The kind of clean, cold rain that washes everything and leaves the world looking sharper than it did before. I thought about the dock, the cold water, the word, sweetheart. I thought about the fence line at Little Creek and the girl in the red t-shirt with her fingers through the chain link. I thought about every room I had walked into where someone had already decided I didn't belong. The briefing rooms, the wardrooms, the classified facilities where men twice my age looked at me and saw a secretary. The kitchen table where my father told me Annapolis was for people who wanted to lead ships and Marines, not for girls who should be teachers. I thought about all of them, and I forgave them. Not because they deserved it, because I was tired of carrying the weight of their limitations alongside the weight of my own career. Some things are too heavy to hold forever. You have to set them down, or they will pull you under. And I had spent 30 years swimming. My mother called me the next morning. Thomas had told her everything. The ceremony, the standing ovation, the conversation on the sidewalk. She was crying. He came home and sat at the kitchen table and held his trident in his hands, and he said, "Linda, I wasted 30 years. I didn't say anything. I just let my mother cry. Because those were the words I had waited my entire life to hear, and hearing them secondhand through my mother's tears on a phone line between Washington and Virginia Beach was exactly right. That was how love moved through our family. Slowly, indirectly, through the women who carried it when the men were too stubborn too. I was 52 years old. I was a Vice Admiral in the United States Navy. I was a surface warfare officer, an intelligence professional, a combat veteran, a destroyer captain, and a flag officer who had spent 30 years building something no one in her family could see. And I was, finally, my father's daughter. Thanksgiving came 6 weeks later. I drove to Virginia Beach for the first time in 2 years. My mother cooked a turkey the size of a small child. Tyler brought Jenny and their 2 kids. And my father met me at the front door. He didn't say much. He just put his hand on my arm and looked at me, really looked at me the way you look at someone when you're trying to memorize their face. He said, "I'm glad you're here, Katie." 4 words. They were enough. We ate dinner as a family. My father asked me about the Pacific deployment exercise. He asked informed questions. He had been reading. Not just the book my mother found on his nightstand, but Navy publications, fleet readiness reports, articles about the role of the DCNO. He was 76 years old, and he was trying. It was late, it was imperfect, but it was real. After dinner, I helped my mother wash dishes. She leaned against my shoulder and said, "He keeps your photograph on the mantel now, Katie, next to the trident." I looked into the living room. There it was, my official Navy photograph. 3 stars, service dress blue, in a silver frame next to the gold seal trident that had owned that shelf for 24 years. 2 symbols of service, side by side. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen in that house. If you have ever spent your whole life trying to prove something to someone who refused to see you, I want you to know something. The proof was never the point. The point was that you kept going, that you showed up, that you didn't ring the bell, and if no one has ever told you they are proud of you, let me be the first. I am proud of you. Now keep going. Standing on that dock in Coronado, soaking wet, looking up at a 28-year-old SEAL who had just learned the hardest lesson of his career, I realized something. The push didn't break me. Nothing had broken me in 30 years. Not my father's silence, not my brother's indifference, not the 100 quiet dismissals that came before that dock. What broke was the wall my family had built between who I was and who they thought I was. And sometimes walls need to come down, even when the demolition is messy. So let me ask you this. Have you ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to believe in you the most? Did you keep going anyway? And if you did, what was the moment they finally saw you? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit subscribe and the bell.